Hey guys, I think it's time to finally finish off a project that I started quite a while ago. This is a Philco 46420, also known as the Hippo. Here's another one that's been fully restored, and I think the reason it's sometimes called a Hippo is because of the way the knobs and the grill kind of look like the face of a hippo. This one, when I got it, had a big crack in the cabinet. In fact, that was not only cracked, but the chunk was actually missing, so I couldn't glue it back on. Luckily, a friend donated a cabinet to my project, but this one was painted white, so I ended up having to strip it down, and now I'm going to repaint it. Here's a photo that shows the two cabinets side by side. Now, in my earlier video on this radio, I showed some tips for stripping off the cabinet. Since I made that, I have finished stripping it. I also had to repair a little crack in the grill and fill in some dings here and there with a little bit of JB Weld and sanded it down. So it's nice and smooth and ready to go now. First up, I'm going to use some white plastic primer. Although this is Bakelite, I experimented on the cracked cabinet and this primer adheres pretty well. I'll then move on to some white specialty lacquer, which I don't believe is actually lacquer. I think it might be more like enamel, but it does give a really nice coating. Then I'll apply a reproduction Philco decal down at the bottom like this one. And then finally clear coat, and then put it all back together. I've already restored the chassis, plays fine. Here's the insert for the grill, and I've got the two knobs stashed away for safekeeping. So next up, I'll head out to the back porch and use the primer. First, I'll give the inside a light coating and give a couple coats to the underside. Once that's dry, I can focus on the actual visible side and spend more time on that. Hopefully 2 or 3 coats will be enough to pretty well cover up the black. Here's the cabinet after a coat of primer. Came out pretty good, except for one area over here where the paint ran a bit. And if you ever encounter this situation, and I think everybody does at some point, don't try to mess with this run when it's wet. Just let it dry, and then afterwards take a small piece of sandpaper, 400, 600 grit, and carefully sand it down, and then put on another coat of paint, either primer or move on to the finish if there's still enough primer there and it looks alright. If you try to mess with this while it's wet, you're just going to make a disaster, make things far worse than they are. It's a nice thing about painting, something that took me a while to learn, is that it's okay to sand paint. In fact, you're going to get the best finish if you do that between the primer, the finish coat, and then the clear coat, is to give it a light sanding. A little light sanding took care of that run, so now I can move on to the white specialty lacquer. Here we are after the first coat of the white specialty lacquer. Things are looking good. I put the bezel in here just for a dry run to make sure everything fit and looked okay. I'm going to pause now and do a little bit of light sanding, because as usual whenever I paint something, a little bit of dust and dirt settles on the paint while it's still wet, and best to get that out now before I continue on further. I think one more good coat of white lacquer after that, and I'll be ready to put on that decal. Here's the cabinet after a couple coats of white lacquer. Things are looking really good. I also picked up a reproduction back, which came in black, and I painted that white. So I'll have a nice back to go with this set. We'll go in something like that. Now while I wait for this lacquer to cure a bit more before I put on a clear coat, how about we see if the radio still works? I restored this, I don't know, 6 months ago, and it's just been sitting on a shelf ever since. I took the tubes out for safekeeping, so time to pop those back in and make sure this still works before I put it all back together. One thing I thought was really cool about this particular radio is that it came with all the original Philco tubes, which are what they call Loctal. You see the label better on this one. So L-O-K-T-A-L. What that is, it's very similar to an octal socket. except that the key pin has this ridge on it, which goes into one of these metal caps down here, and it actually snaps into place. I believe these were invented for car radios, so the vibration of the motor wouldn't loosen up the tubes. Another interesting thing about these radios is this socket. These were made in '46, in other words right after World War II, when there were shortages of certain tube types. So some of these radios have a 50L6 audio output tube, which is something like a 6V6 you may be more familiar with. But on some production runs they ran out of those and used a 50B5, which is a miniature type, so there's an adapter on the socket to go from octal to this little jobber. They sound fine, but this tube runs pretty darn hot. But that's the way they made it, so I'm not going to mess with it. I'll pop the rest of these tubes back in and try to fire this radio up again. Okay, I've got all the tubes in place. I rigged up a crude loop antenna, so let's give this a try. Oh, something. Again, I just have a crude antenna, so the reception, didn't expect it to be very good.
Visit ChristianPublishing.com for your free guide to Christian
the radio
publishing.
is still working.
And you'll find out about the special.
So as soon as that finish dries, I'll be able to pop this back in.
Works with your body to help stop and reverse bone loss. So ask your doctor about Boniva today. Boniva is a wonderful.
Now it's time to put on the decal. I picked up an assortment sheet of Philco radio decals. I picked one out that's pretty close to the original size. I've got some lukewarm water here with just a drop of dish detergent. That'll help break up the surface tension, so when I put a little bit of water on the cabinet, it'll spread around instead of beating up into small drops. I'll put the decal in the water. It's just like putting on any model decal. We'll let it soak for a while. It'll start loosening up from the paper. Then carry that carefully over to the radio and slide it off. And then I use a very soft brush that's damp to carefully position the decal and then let it dry. Here it is after applying the decal and one coat of clear coat. A couple more coats of clear and this cabinet will be all done.
Or tomorrow morning right here at ESPN 1000 or ESPNChicago.com.
Here's the radio all back together. I've got it next to my other Philco 46420 that's in the plain brown Bakelite. After that decal set up, I clear coated this with a few coats of clear lacquer, and then I buffed it out and put on some Megwire's Tech Wax, car wax. Nice and shiny, nice and smooth. I then put the dial face back in, put the chassis back in, and put on the back. Now, I don't have the clips that are supposed to hold this back on, so I just have some foam wedges in place. Here's what they look like on the other radio. There are metal clips that slide onto the cardboard and then clip onto the Bakelite. Kind of specialized, made of spring steel. Maybe there's some reproductions out there, but I haven't been able to find any. But for the time being, the foam's holding it on just fine. So this is an original back, and it has labels on here. The Philco, your guarantee of safety, pointing to an Underwriter Laboratory seal of approval. So I took this back, threw it on my flatbed scanner, and then printed out on just some plain paper new stickers, cut them out and glued them on. I also glued in the loop antenna, you can see it running around down here. And for a final touch, I put a white cord on this radio and a brown cord on the other radio. Both are playing just fine.
For Michael Wright,
So here's
I
the
am
white
Jeff
radio.
Dickerson. Thanks for calling in. Thanks for listening. Bears practice
radio.
tomorrow night.
Brown radio is a bit louder. I check on the audio output tube. Maybe it's a little bit weaker on this guy, but in general, they're both working just fine.
You're listening to ESPN Radio 1000 WMVP.
So I guess I have AM stereo in effect, but it's both the same thing on both channels. I hope you enjoyed this little series on how to paint a Bakelite cabinet.